So we've discussed our house beer lineup and the spectrum of flavors we want to lay out there for our guests who come in the door. And those are the 5 beers that we will always have available, things that the guests can count on. Now, beyond that, we have a number of specialty beers we brew throughout the year. And the purpose of these beers is to fill in gaps in those flavor profiles of our house beers, expand that flavor spectrum, so we can really have a dynamic lineup for all sorts of guests that come in the door and drink our specialty beers. Now, the specialty beers are kind of broken up into similar categories as we talked about the house beers, and certainly there's always an opportunity to have a light, malty, hoppy. You know, we don't often have other dark beers. Sometimes we'll have other wheat beers on tap at the same time. Certainly summertime's a great time to have multiple wheat beers on. But as we walk into the specialty beers, pay attention to the breadth of flavors and how we're going to kind of stretch out our beer lineup and give more opportunities for the guests to enjoy the toils of our labor in the brewery. Earlier we spoke about our beer lineup and how we build it across the year to match the seasons and people's taste, and what we do with our beers has to line up with what the folks walking in the door are looking to drink. So we had some categories that we're working with. We had a light category and a malty or balanced beer category. We had the hoppy beer, we had the black beer, dark beer, and we also had the wheat beer. Well, as we build that lineup and we want to slot more beers in, we try to figure out how to stretch that flavor spectrum out a little bit and have different styles, and we still categorize them to help us understand how the lineup works together. One of the categories we might talk about is fruit beers, right? Summertime, we might put fruit, or we also put botanicals like lavender or chamomile in some of the Belgian ales that we make. So there's a lot of different ways to use flavors that are not within the 4 main ingredients of making beer to bring a lot of more complexity or different aspects to the beer that the guests might like. And fruit is certainly one of those. So we'll make apricot beers, we make raspberry beers, all sorts of different flavors of fruit beers. And as I mentioned, some of our Belgian beers like Saisons are now going to use more botanicals. We've had lemongrass, we had a cucumber Saison recently, which was very good. So there's a lot of different flavors that we can bring to these beers that get outside of the 4 main ingredients. And that might be one of the categories that we push out as we're filling in our beer lineup. So another category we might try to define a little bit to help fill out our general beer lineup is, we might call it international appeal. So there are a lot of great brewing traditions around the world, and we at times try to emulate some of those. And some of the main ones that might come to mind might be the great German lager brewing tradition, the wonderful ales of Belgium, the English brewing traditions, which is really the basis for a lot of the beers that we make today. So if we were to look at each of those styles, we might say, okay, within the lager category, there's a lot of great beers. There are dark beers and lighter beers. There's pilsners and dunkels and such like that. But even more so, we can break those down into lager beers that are brewed in the periphery of Germany, right? We've got the great Czech pilsners like Czechvar and Pilsner Urquell. We've got some great Polish lagers that people love, the Grodzikis and such like that, smoke lagers. So there's a lot of great beers that we can try there. We can go to Belgium, and there's some wonderful styles that come out of Belgium that are very yeast dependent for their flavors. They also use a lot of spicing and other flavors in those beers. A little bit broader spectrum of flavors for sure. A lot of times yeast or malt characters are really higher in those beers than the hoppy characters are. And you might think of styles like Saison or Abbey doubles and triples as styles that you've tried in the past that exhibit some of these flavors of Belgian beers. You know, then in the English or the British brewing traditions, you know, we certainly have pale ales and bitters and IPAs that are very traditional beers. A lot of the styles that we might brew here along those lines, we brew great Scottish style ales, very malty flavored beers that people really enjoy. So trying to fit in some of these international styles and flavors, and it gives our brewers a chance to drill down to some great brewing traditions, and gives our guests an opportunity to broaden their palates and learn more about those international traditions. Another category we might define as we're filling out our beer lineup would be those of the higher alcohol beers, stronger beers. These beers would typically have an ABV over 8%, ABV being alcohol by volume. So these are getting to be pretty strong beers. We have to be very cautious about how we serve them. So oftentimes we do serve those beers in smaller glasses. Some of the styles that come to mind would be barley wines, which come from Britain. Big malty beer. More and more these days we'll see a lot of hop character thrown into these beers as well. Belgian beers, the Belgian styles have a lot of great high alcohol opportunities. Certainly people are familiar with ABT triples. Very strong beer, but not super hoppy, but strong flavored from the yeast that go in there. Very, very tasty. These higher alcohol beers certainly have a place in time. We see more people drinking these, and we certainly brew a lot of these beers during the fall and winter months. Just another great beer that we can use to extend our portfolio. Over the course of time, we've gotten into barrel aging beers. So this is taking a tradition more familiar in spirits making or wine making and finding ways to pick up those great flavors of the wood and sometimes of the spirit or wine that used to be in that barrel and getting those flavors into our beers. And 5, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this was primarily done with big stouts and brown ales and bourbon barrels with lots of flavor. And now we're finding all kinds of different ways to utilize those flavors that come out of the barrels. We're using different types of spirits barrels like tequila and rum, moving towards wine with sherry and different types of white and red wines. The great oak flavors that come out of those barrels really impart a lot of great vanilla, sometimes all the way to coconut type flavors in the barrel aged beers that we make. And so this is another little bit more esoteric, a little bit more on the beer geek aficionado end of the spectrum of our beer lineup, but we really want to accommodate a bunch of those folks as well, because they're opinion leaders in their peer groups. People like them and want to talk to with them about beer, and we can utilize their expertise to shine a light on these great barrel aged beers that we're making at Rock Bottom these days.